I have buried 2 wives in my long life and never married either of them. I mean that the way an old man means a thing he has finally made peace with. I stood at the foot of more than one grave on the Renner place and felt the loss like it was kin, because by then it was. But the first time I ever saw the woman who would put the heart back into that ranch, I thought to myself, plain as a fence post, that Holt Renner had made a terrible mistake and was about to find out the size of it on a public platform in front of the whole of Hales Crossing. I was his foreman then, Bram Toller, going on 20 years at his side, and I'd watched that man turn from a green boy into a wall. So when the noon train came hissing into our raw little depot that spring day and Holt stood there in his one good coat with his hat in his hands like a schoolboy, I knew what he wanted off that train. He wanted quiet. He'd sent away for quiet the way another man sends away for a plow, something useful, something that would do its work and not trouble him, something to fill the cold half of a house that had been cold for 10 years. What stepped down onto our platform was not quiet. She came down the iron steps with one hand holding her hat against the wind and the other already pointing past Holt at the freight car, where a boy was wrestling a crate marked in chalk, and her voice carried clean over the whole platform. "Mind that crate, young man. There's a copper proofing bowl in there older than your grandmother, and I'll not have it dented." Then she turned and looked Holt up and down, quick, the way I look a horse over before I buy it, and she put out her hand to shake his like a man would, and she said, "You'll be Mr. Renner. You're taller than your letter." Holt took her hand because he didn't know what else to do with his own. "Ma'am," he said. "Augusta Price," she said. "Though no one's called me Augusta since my mother died, and she only did it when I was in trouble. You'll call me Gus, and I'll know we're getting on. Now where's the rest of my freight? I had 4 crates and a barrel, and they're worth more to me than I am, so don't let that boy stack the barrel on the copper." I have laughed about that morning every year of my life since, but I did not laugh that morning. That morning I watched Holt Renner's face do a thing I'd not seen it do in a decade. It came open, just for a second, surprised right out of its stone. And then it shut again, harder than before, because surprise was a thing he'd taught himself not to suffer. "You sent 4 crates," he said. It wasn't a question, he was working something out. "I sent everything I own," Gus said brisk, already walking toward the freight car, so that the 2 of us had to follow her on her own platform like we were the ones just arrived. "A woman doesn't cross half the country to leave her tools behind. You'll want to know what's in them, I expect, so you can stop looking at me like I've brought a circus. Bowls. Tins 3 dozen, and they're seasoned, so no one's to scrub them. 2 long peels. A marble slab my father shipped from Vermont, and if it cracked on the rail I will weep, and I am not a woman who weeps, so it had better not have. And the barrel is flour, the good hard wheat, because I'm told this territory grinds soft and I'll not bake a wedding cake out of paste." Holt stopped walking. "A wedding cake." "In general," Gus said. "For other people. I make my living off other people's good days, Mr. Renner, that's the trade." She found her copper bowl, took it from the boy with both hands, and held it against her hip like a woman holds a child, and she looked at my employer over the rim of it, and something in her steadied. "You read my letter," she said, gentler now. "I read yours, so let's neither of us pretend. You want a wife to keep your house and warm your table and not ask you for much, because somewhere back there a woman did all that and then she died and you've not got over it." Holt went white around the mouth. She didn't flinch. "I want passage west and a man who won't lie to me and a roof while I build what I came to build. We can each get a piece of what we want, or we can be honest sooner rather than later. I prefer sooner. It saves crockery." "And what is it," Holt said very low, "that you came to build?" Smiled then for the first time, and it changed her whole plain face into something you'd cross a street to see again. "My own bake shop," Gus Price said. "Right here in this dusty, half-finished, wind-scoured town that doesn't know yet it can't live without me. I'm going to build the best bake shop between the river and the mountains, and I'm going to own it. Not you, not the bank, not any man, me." She hitched the copper bowl higher. "Now, is your wagon the one with the gray team? Good. Load the barrel last." I want to tell you, Holt set his jaw and put her right back on the train. He'd have been within his rights. He'd advertised for one thing and got its opposite. The way a man orders a quiet bay mare and gets handed a green stallion with opinions. And on the ride out to the ranch he meant too. I could see it in him, the way he held the lines too tight and stared at the road. Gus rode in the wagon bed among her crates with her hand flat on the marble slab the whole way, like she could keep it from cracking through her palm, and she did not fill the silence, which surprised me about her, then and ever after. She could be loud as a brass band when she wanted, and quiet as church when it mattered, and she always knew which the moment asked for. We got to the home place near dusk. The Renner place lay where Bridle Creek came down out of the hills and spread itself slow across good grass, and in the long light it looked the way it always looked, like more than one man should rightly have to hold alone. The big house dark, the barns the breaking pens, the long bunkhouse where the boys were already lit up and noisy. Holt drew up in the yard and sat a moment. "There's a room off the kitchen," he said to the horses, not to her. "Was the keeping room, it's dry, you'll have it." "And the kitchen," Gus said. "It's a kitchen." "Is there an oven, or one of those mean little iron boxes that won't hold a heat?" Holt's jaw worked. "It's a stove," he said. "It cooks." "It cooks," Gus repeated, in the tone a doctor uses on a man who's described his own broken leg as a stubbed toe, and she climbed down without help and went to look at the thing herself. And that was the last word Holt got in that night, because she came out 20 minutes later having found his coffee and his bread box, and she held up the heel of the loaf I'd cut that morning, store loaf, hard as a hoof, and she looked at the three of us standing in the doorway like we'd been caught at something. And she said, "Good heavens, how are you not dead?" And then she laughed, and it was such a warm laugh, so entirely without meanness in it, that the youngest hand laughed back before he could help it, and Holt turned and went out to see to horses that did not need seeing to. That's the part folks always want when I tell it, the spark. 2 flints struck. And it's true there was a spark, but a spark's an easy thing. Anybody can throw a spark. What I watched over that spring and summer was harder and better than a spark, and it's the thing I'd want a young man to hear if he asked me how it's done. I watched 2 stubborn people learn the other one's worth against their own will and choose it anyway. That's the whole secret. The spark's the easy part. She baked the next morning, before any of us were up. I came across the yard in the gray before sunup, the way I'd done 10,000 mornings, and the kitchen window was gold, and there was smoke from the chimney, the good kind, and a smell coming off that house that stopped me dead in my boots in the cold. Bread. Real bread, the kind my own mother used to make before the war took my father and the bread got thin. I stood in that yard and I was 9 years old again, and I'm not ashamed to say my eyes stung. The bunkhouse came awake like a kicked anthill. Those boys came out pulling on their shirts and following their noses, and Gus Price stood in Holt Renner's kitchen doorway with flour to her elbows and a wooden spoon in her fist and looked at the lot of us, 6 rough men who hadn't had a soft thing said to us in years, and she said, "Wash all of you. I'll not feed a hand that can't be bothered to find the pump. There's biscuits when you're clean and not before." Reader, they ran to that pump. She fed us at the long table that morning, biscuits and gravy and a loaf still too hot to cut proper, and she stood over us with her arms folded and watched us eat the way a general watches a battle she already knows she's won. And Holt came in last, having found every reason in the world to be elsewhere. And he sat at the head of his own table, looking like a man who'd come home to find strangers in his parlor. And Gus set a plate in front of him without a word, and went back to her stove. And I watched him pick up the biscuit, and I watched him taste it, and I watched something move across that stone face that I will carry to my own grave. Because I'd known the man's whole sorrow. I'd carried the second shovel at the burying, and I knew the taste of that biscuit had just walked him straight back into a kitchen 10 years gone and a woman 10 years dead, and it had hurt him, and he had not expected to be glad of the hurt. He set the biscuit down. "It's good," he said. "I know it's good," Gus said, not turning around. "I've been doing it 20 years. The question is whether the town will know it's good, and that's a different animal. The town, Holt said. You can't think I crossed the country to bake for 6 cowhands, and a man who looks at his food like it's going to bite him. She turned around then, wiping her hands. I need a building. I need an oven that doesn't share its heat with a coffee pot. I need a place on the main street where a woman coming to market will pass my window and smell my window and not be able to walk on by. You said there's a bank in Hales Crossing. There's a bank. Then after these horses of yours are seen to, Gus said, I'd be obliged for the loan of the wagon and a man who knows the road, and I'll go and introduce myself to the future. That was the start of it, the part of the story that's hers, and that I think she'd want told first, before any of the part that's his, because she'd built more of herself by the time she met Holt than he'd built in 10 years of grieving, and she'd not thank me for making her courtship the spine of her life. So let me tell you what she walked into in Hales Crossing, and how she met it. She met it the way she met everything, head up, hand out, no apology. I drove her in. The town was new and raw and full of itself, the way those depot towns were. The railroad had come through 2 years before, and the place had gone from a crossroads with a water tank to a main street of false fronts overnight. All of it loud and grasping and certain it would be a city by and by. There was a mercantile and a land office in the bank, and a hotel that called itself the Grand and wasn't, and there was Mrs. Odell Frayne, who I'll get to, because every town has a Mrs. Frayne, and a story like this needs one. Gus went into the bank like she owned the note on it. She came out an hour later with her chin up and her color high, and she got up onto the wagon seat beside me and sat very straight and said, "Well," and then she didn't say anything else for a mile. "Bank tell you no," I said. "The bank," Gus said, "told me that it does not extend credit to a woman without her husband's signature, and when I told him I had no husband he asked me why on God's earth I'd come west, and I told him to bake bread, and he laughed at me, Bram. He laughed at me like I'd told him I'd come to be queen. Some of these towns," I started. "I've been laughed at before," she said, cutting me off, but not unkind, cutting herself off, really, getting hold of the thing. "I was laughed at in 3 cities before this one. A woman with her own trade and her own opinions and no man's name to hide behind is a comedy to a certain kind of fellow, and the certain kind of fellow runs the banks." She set her jaw. "But I have learned a thing about being laughed at, Bram, and it's this. The trick is to outlast it. You bake and you bake and you give it away if you have to, until the very men who laughed are standing in line at your door pretending they were never anything but your friends, and then you charge them double." She looked at me sideways. "I'm joking about the double, mostly." I laughed. I couldn't help it. And she grinned, pleased with herself, and I thought, that's a person. Whatever else comes, that is a whole entire person, sitting on this wagon seat, and Holt Renner sent away for a piece of furniture. She baked. Lord, how she baked. She had no shop, so she made the ranch her oven and the road her shop. She baked at Holt's stove every dawn, and she fixed that stove, too, got down on the floor in her good dress and pulled the thing half apart and found where the flue was choked and cleaned it and got it to hold a heat at last. And Holt found her there with soot on her face and didn't say a word, just stood in the doorway holding 2 horseshoes he'd carried in for no reason at all, and then carried back out again. She baked, and on market days she had me drive her in, and she set up a plank on 2 barrels at the edge of the square and laid out loaves and pies under a clean cloth, and she did not call out or holler her wares like the others. She just stood there in the smell of it, and the smell did the calling. The first week she sold 4 loaves and gave away 9. The second week she sold a dozen and a pie, and a freighter bought a whole loaf to eat in the saddle and came back the next market day to buy 3. By the 4th week, there was a little knot of women at her plank, and the thing about women, Gus told me, is that a woman will not be the first to buy from a stranger, but she will be the second in a heartbeat. So all you ever need is the one brave soul, and the rest is just patience. The one brave soul, as it happened, was the school teacher, A thin, earnest young woman named Miss Verbena Coyle who lived alone and ate poorly and bought a small loaf and a single tart and stood eating the tart right there in the square with her eyes shut. And Gus watched her and said quietly, "There, that one. She just told the whole town it's safe," and she was right. But there was Mrs. Odell Frayne. Mrs. Frayne was the wife of the man who owned the mercantile and half the main street besides, and she had decided, in the way such women decide, that she was the arbiter of who and what belonged in Hale's Crossing, and she had decided that a manless woman selling bread off a plank was not a thing that belonged. She didn't say it to Gus. She said it around Gus, the way that kind always does, a word to this one, a lifted eyebrow to that one, a remark about not knowing who a person was or where they'd come from or what sort of woman travels alone, said just loud enough. And the little knot of women at the plank would thin when Mrs. Frayne came near, and Gus would stand there with her chin up and her wares uncovered and pretend she hadn't heard. And on the ride home those days she was quiet the bad way, not the good way. It was Mrs. Frayne, in the end, who set Holt Renner loose, though she'd have died before she knew she'd done it. It happened at the midsummer market. Gus had a good day going. She got an order, her first real order, from the hotel that called itself the Grand, 24 rolls for a railroad man's dinner, and she was lit up about it the way she got, and the women were 3 deep at her plank, when Mrs. Frayne came across the square with her market basket and her 2 grown daughters and stopped a little way off and said to her daughters, but to the whole square, that it was a pity, wasn't it, a real pity, that a town tried to make itself respectable and then any sort of woman could just step off a train and set up shop, no husband, no people, no church behind her, and who was to say what she'd been before she came west? A woman like that, alone, and a person had to think of the children. And the women at the plank went still and looked at their feet. And Gus Price put down the loaf in her hands very carefully, and I saw her gather herself to answer it. And I want you to understand, she'd have answered it well. She had a tongue that could take the hide off, and she'd have skinned Odell Frayne's wife in front of the whole town and been right too. But the thing about being right too is that it costs you anyway, in a town that small, and Gus knew it, and you could see her counting the cost even as she got ready to pay it. She never got the chance, because Holt Renner, who was supposed to be out at the back pens that day and had no business in town at all, was leaning against the corner of the land office not 30 feet away with his hat down, and he straightened up off that wall, and he walked over. I'd known the man 20 years, and I'd never once heard him court a fuss. He went out of his way around trouble the way water goes around a rock. But he walked across that square in the dead silence with his spurs going chink, 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 the only sound in the whole town, and he stopped beside Gus Price's plank, and he took off his hat to Mrs. Frayne, polite as Sunday, and he said, "Ma'am, I don't believe you've met Miss Price. She's at my place." A pause just long enough. "She's the finest hand with bread I ever ate, and I've ate in 2 states. And I'd take it as a kindness if the town treated her like what she is, which is the best thing that's come to it since the rail." He set his hat back on. "Now I'll have 2 of those pies, Gus, if there's 2 left. The boys'll riot if I come home with 1. You could have heard a feather land." Gus Price looked at Holt Renner like she'd never seen him before. And maybe she hadn't, not that one, the one who just walked across a public square to stand at her shoulder in front of the woman who ran the town. Then she got hold of herself and wrapped 2 pies in clean cloth, brisk as ever, and said, "That'll be 40 cents, Mr. Renner, and you'll bring the cloths back." And the whole square breathed out at once, and Mrs. Frayne gathered her daughters and her basket and her dignity and went off, and the women came back to the plank, and somebody, I think it was the schoolteacher, laughed. And then they were all buying, all of them, like they were buying their way out of having stood silent, and Gus sold out by noon. On the ride home she didn't say anything for the first mile, same as the bank day, but it was the other kind of quiet. Then she said, "He didn't have to do that." "No," I said. "He doesn't put himself forward. I've watched him a month. He'd ride a mile around a barking dog." "He would," I said. "Then why?" she said and stopped. I'm an old man now and I've earned the right to say what I think, but I was younger then and I had the sense to keep my own counsel, so I just clucked to the team and let her work it out. She worked at it the whole rest of the way. I could see her at it, turning it over. And when we came down the last grade with the ranch laid out gold below us, she said, very low, almost not to me at all, "I didn't come here to fall for a sad man with a buried wife. I came here to build a bake shop." "I know it," I said. "A woman does that, gets soft on the first man who's kind to her, and the next thing she's give up everything she came for and she's stirring his oatmeal till she dies. I've seen it. I've seen it a dozen times. The shop becomes his, the loan goes in his name, the trade's a hobby they let her keep till the bobbies come. I won't. I'd sooner not love anybody at all than be made small by it." "That's a hard road," I said, "loving nobody." "It's a clear one," she said. And then she didn't say anything else, and I let her not say it, and we came home, and that was the night I understood that the danger in the thing wasn't that Holt wouldn't crack. The danger was that he would, and she'd have to decide whether to let it cost her the very thing she'd crossed the country to build. Because she was right about how it usually went. She'd seen it true. The world did take a woman's dream and fold it small and call it a wife. That was the real trouble in the story. Bigger than any Mrs. Frayne, not a villain you could face down, but the plain shape of how things mostly went. What I want you to understand about Holt is that he didn't court her the way a man courts. He'd forgot how, or he'd buried how along with everything else. He courted her the only way he had left, which was with work in the dark, where she couldn't see him do it and thank him and make him feel a fool. Her wagon, the old high-wheeled rig she'd shipped her crates in and meant to use for her market runs, had a cracked felloe and a wheel about to fail, and she'd talked about it, worried about it out loud, because a busted wheel on the town road was a day's bread spoiled. And one morning she went to it and it was mended. New fellow, the wheel trued, the box greased, all of it done in the night by hands that left no note. She knew whose hands, she didn't say. But the next morning there was an extra good loaf at the head of the table where Holt sat, the round one with the seeds he'd taken to, and that was her note back. And the two of them ate at that table, not looking at each other like a couple of bashful children, and the hands and I kept our faces in our plates and our boots on the floor. The oven came next, and that was the big one. She'd been making do with his stove all spring, and she'd worked wonders with it. But she knew, and we all knew, that her dream needed a real oven, a baker's oven, the brick kind with the deep firebox and the doored chamber that holds a heat all day. And there wasn't such a thing for sale within 100 miles, and the bank had laughed at the loan that would have bought the bricks. She'd put the dream up on a shelf, not gone, just up where she couldn't reach it for a while. And she was the kind that could live with a thing on a shelf and not grieve it out loud. But I knew it weighed on her, because she stopped talking about the future for a stretch there, and Gus Price talking about the future was as natural as Gus Price breathing. Then Holt rode off for 3 days, said it was for stock, came back with a wagon and didn't unload it where we could see, and for 2 weeks after, every evening when the day's work was done and the rest of us were dead on our feet, the man would go down to the empty stone spring house by the creek with a lantern, and there'd be the sound of a trowel and brick on brick, late into the night. He'd found a mason. He'd ridden the 3 days to the next town to find a man who knew how to lay a baker's oven and brought him back, and the two of them built it in the old spring house where the creek would keep it cool to work in and the stone walls would hold the heat, built her a proper baker's oven, brick-domed, deep-floored, a flue that drew like a dream, the kind of oven she described to me once on the wagon seat with her eyes shining, not knowing he was leaning in the barn door behind us, listening. He never told her. The fool man built her the one thing in the world she wanted most and then couldn't bring himself to say so. He just let her find it. She found it on a Sunday morning. He'd contrived to have the springhouse door standing open and the oven fired. He'd lit it himself before dawn, got it good and hot, so that when she came down to the creek for water there'd be heat coming off the stone and smoke off the little chimney he'd built, and she'd have to go and see. And she went and saw. And I happened to be crossing to the barn, and I happened to look down at the creek, so I'm a witness to this too, though they never knew it. She stood in that doorway a long time, long enough that I got worried. Then she went in and she came out and she went in again, and the second time she stayed, and after a while Holt came down from the house. He'd been watching from a window like a coward, the dear man, and he stopped at the springhouse door with his hands hanging, and I was too far to hear, but I didn't need to hear. She was standing in the middle of her oven, her own oven at last, with her hand flat on the warm brick the way she'd held her hand flat on the marble slab on the ride out from the depot, like she could keep a thing from breaking through her palm. And she was crying. Gus Price, who told me she was not a woman who wept, was weeping in front of that oven with her whole face open. And Holt Renner stood in the door and didn't go to her and didn't go away, just stood. The way he'd stood at the grave I'd dug, helpless and present, which is the most a hard man knows how to be. And then she turned around and saw him, and she wiped her face with the back of her floury hand, and she said something, and he said something, and whatever it was the closest the two of them had come to the truth, and I had the decency to go on to the barn and leave them to it. I asked her about it once years on, what was said in the spring house. She thought about it a long while, the way she did when a thing mattered, and she said, I thanked him, and I told him it didn't change anything, that it was still going to be my shop, my name on the door, my loan, my trade, that I'd take the oven as a gift between two people who respected each other and not a string on me. She smiled, that smile that lit the whole plain face. And he said, I'll never forget it, Bram. He said, it's so quiet, he said. I didn't build it to put a string on you. I built it because a woman ought to have the tool that fits her hand. And that, she said, that was the moment, not the oven. The oven I'd have thanked any man for. It was the man knowing the difference. It was him building me a bigger room instead of a smaller one. There's not one man in 1,000 does that. I'd have married him on the spot. Only I had 400 loaves to bake and a town to conquer, and a woman has to keep her head. But the oven wasn't the end of the trouble, because a dream like hers doesn't run downhill once it's started. There was still the shop to be had, the building on the main street, the place in town where the town could find her, and the shop meant money, and money meant the bank. And the bank still wouldn't lend to a woman, husband or no, oven or no. She wouldn't take Holt's money. I want that understood because it's the iron in her. He offered. Of course he offered. By midsummer he'd have given her the deed to the whole ranch if she'd take it. The man was so far gone. And she said no. She said, if you buy me the shop, Holt, then it's your shop with my flour in it, and in 20 years some fool will say to my face that the rancher set his wife up in a little business to keep her busy, and I will have to smile at him, and I would rather die. I will have it on my own note, or I will have it not at all. And he looked like she'd struck him, but here's the measure of the man. He didn't argue. He thought about it. He took her seriously, which is the rarest courtship there is. And he said, all right. Then how do we get you a note of your own? He said we. And she heard it and she didn't correct him. And I think that was the second moment, the one she didn't tell me about. It was Gus herself who found the way, naturally. She'd been baking for the hotel and the freighters and half the women in town all summer. And she'd been keeping books, kept books like a banker, that woman. Every loaf and every penny in a ledger. And she went back to the bank in the fall with her ledger under her arm and laid it open on the manager's desk and showed him a season of trade, real trade, growing trade, money that was already moving whether he liked it or not. And she said she didn't need his charity and never had. She needed his arithmetic. And would he kindly read her numbers and tell her what a man with those numbers would be lent? And the manager, to his credit, or to his greed, which in a banker amount to the same thing, read the numbers. And the numbers didn't care that she was a woman. The numbers said she was the best small risk in his book. He'd have made her find a man to cosign even then, I think, just to save his pride. But she'd thought of that too. She'd gone the day before to the school teacher, Miss Verbena Coyle, the brave soul who'd bought the first tart, and the two of them and a third woman, a young widow named Mrs. Sayers who ran the boarding house and had buried a husband and a fool's notions both. had agreed among themselves to stand the note together. 3 women's names on one piece of paper, each one not enough alone and all 3 together more than enough, so that no man's signature need touch it at all. I don't know that it had ever been done in that territory. It made the manager sweat, but the numbers were the numbers and he signed. She bought the building on the main street, the one with the wide window facing the morning side, where a woman coming to market would smell her window and not be able to walk on by, exactly as she'd said on the very first morning. And she moved her oven. No, she didn't move the oven was brick and stayed at the creek where Holt built it. And for the rest of their lives the special things, the wedding cakes and the Christmas breads, the things that mattered most, came out of that springhouse oven and were carried into town, which is a thing I always loved about it, that her trade had 2 homes and so did her heart. But she built a second oven in the shop, and she had a sign painted, and the sign said PRYCES, just that. Her own name, no man's, and underneath in smaller letters bread, cakes, PIES. And the morning they hung it, Holt Renner stood in the street and looked up at her name on her shop, and I have never seen a man so proud of a thing that wasn't his and never would be. She opened on a Saturday. The whole town came, even Mrs. Frayne, who bought a seed loaf and a dozen rolls and said stiffly that they were very good, which from Odell Frayne's wife was a surrender with the bands playing, and Gus took her money and thanked her and gave her an extra roll, no charge, for the road, with a smile so sweet and so victorious that I had to go outside and laugh into my hat. And it was that night, after the town had gone home and the shop was swept and the takings counted, a good day, a great day, the best of her life to that point, that Holt asked her. Not before. He'd had the question in him all summer and he'd held it, because he understood, finally, the one thing he had to understand, that he couldn't ask her until her shop was hers, free and standing, on her own name and her own note, so that when she answered she'd be answering as a woman who had everything she came for and wanted him on top of it, and not as a woman choosing between a man and her dream. He'd waited so that there'd be no choosing. He'd made himself the thing she got to have as well as, not instead of. I told you he was no kind of saint, that man. He was slow and silent and stubborn as a stump. But on this one thing, the thing that counted, he was wiser than any clever man I ever knew. I wasn't there for the asking. They never told me the words and I never asked, because some doors a man shouldn't push on. But I was there the next morning, and she came out of that shop with her sleeves rolled and flour to her elbows, same as the first morning at the ranch, and Holt was hitching the team to drive her home, and she stopped in the doorway under her own painted name and she looked at him, and she said loud enough for me to hear, because she wanted me to hear, I think, wanted somebody to bear it witness, she said. Yes then, but understand me, Holt Renner, I keep the shop, I keep the name on the door, I keep my note and my books and my trade till the day they bury me. You're not getting a wife, you're getting a baker who'll have you, those are my terms. And Holt Renner, who'd sent away in the spring for a quiet woman to keep his house and not trouble him, stood in the street with the lines in his hands and the morning coming up gold behind him, and he said, "Those are good terms, I'll take 'em." And then, because the man could not help himself, because the stone had truly cracked all the way through at last and there was a living spring under it, but I get the seed loaf for life. And she laughed that warm laugh, the one without an ounce of meanness in it, the one that had made the youngest hand laugh back on the very first night, and she came down the step and took his hand, not to shake it like a man this time but to hold it, and that's where I'll leave the 2 of them, hand in front of her shop, because what came after is just the long good plain stuff of a marriage and you don't need me to tell it. They married in the fall in the churchyard, the school teacher and the widow Sayers standing up for her and the whole town there, and Mrs. Frayne crying for no reason the way her sort do at weddings, all enemies forgiven by the cake. And the cake, I have to tell you about the cake. The cake was the only one Gus Price ever baked that she wouldn't take a penny for, because she said a baker spends her whole life making other people's good days, and just this once the good day was her own, and she baked it in the spring house oven Holt built. 3 tiers. The finest thing those hills ever saw, and she carried it into town herself in the Mendied wagon and wouldn't let a soul touch it. She built the best bake shop between the river and the mountains, exactly like she said she would, that first dusty morning when the town didn't know yet it couldn't live without her. She built it on her own name and her own note, and she ran it 40 years. And when the railroad brought the town up into a real town the way it always promised, PRYCEAS was the oldest sign on the street and the proudest. And folks who'd been children when she opened brought their own children, and their children's children, to stand at the wide window and smell the window and not be able to walk on by. And Holt got his quiet in the end, though never the kind he'd ordered. He got the quiet of a man who's done his loving right. He'd ride in from the ranch at the end of a day and sit in the corner of her shop where she let nobody else sit, and he'd drink his coffee and watch her run her little kingdom, the flour and the fire and the line of folks out the door. Watch her be the whole entire person she'd been on the wagon seat the first day, undimmed, unfolded, made bigger by him and not 1 inch smaller. And he'd have on his face the look of a man who'd been handed the one thing he never thought to ask for and had the sense, just once in his hard life, not to ruin it. I buried them both in the end, side by side under the cottonwoods by Bridle Creek, within sight of the spring house where her oven still stood, where it stands yet, for all I know. I dug the second grave the way I dug the first one all those years before, when I thought my friend's heart was buried for good. It wasn't, of course. It had only been waiting, the way a banked fire waits, for the right hand to come and open the flue and let it draw. I've thought about it my whole long life since, what made it work, those 2 flint-and-iron people who'd no business under the same roof. And I always come back to the oven. Not the spark of them, anybody can throw a spark. The oven. A man who loved a woman and built her a bigger room to be herself in, instead of a smaller one to keep her in. Who waited and held his question and made himself a thing she got to have as well as everything she dreamed, and never once asked her to choose. That's the whole secret. I've never found a better one. If a young man ever asks me how it's done, that's what I'll tell him. Find out what she came west to build, and then, God help you, build it bigger.